industrial complex as a series of disconnected explosions, a scandal here, an election there, a sudden resignation, a surprising poll number. We are encouraged to view these events as merely the churn of the news cycle, the static of democracy. But occasionally, a designation that sounds merely journalistic, the newsmaker of the year, serves as a marker for something far more profound than celebrity or notoriety. It signals a shift in the tectonic plates of the nation's institutional life. The Canadian press has named Prime Minister Mark Carney its newsmaker of the year for 2025. And while you might be tempted to glaze over yet another end-of-year accolade, I would urge you to look closer. This is not a participation trophy. It is the certification of a political miracle, or perhaps more accurately, a political resurrection that defies almost every conventional rule of modern parliamentary democracy. Consider for a moment the sheer velocity of the history we have just witnessed. A year ago, the Liberal Party of Canada appeared to be not merely dying, but actively decomposing. The previous Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had been in power for nearly a decade, a duration that in democratic politics usually invites a restless fatigue from the electorate. The polls suggested an extinction-level event was on the horizon. The Conservative opposition, led by Pierre Poilievre, was measuring the drapes for a massive majority government. The machinery of the Liberal Party, the most successful political organization in the Western world during the 20th century, seemed jammed, rusted, and out of ideas. And then the machinery did what it has done at crucial junctures in its history. It did not look within its own parliamentary ranks for a savior. It looked outward to the realm of high expertise and technocratic prestige. It imported Mark Carney. The story officially runs like this. In March of 2025, Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a man who had never held elected office, never kissed a baby on a rope line, never sat in the backbenches heckling opponents, swept the Liberal leadership race. He did not merely win. He secured more than 80% of the vote on the first ballot. This was not a contest. It was a coronation. He replaced Trudeau, and within weeks, rather than cautiously navigating a caretaker premiership, he took the country into a general election. By all conventional wisdom, a man dubbed a bloodless banker by his critics, running against a populist wave, should have been crushed. Instead, he won, and he has spent the remainder of this year serving as the primary shield for the Canadian economy against the protectionist volleys of a returning Donald Trump. But here is where I want you to pause and consider the institutional peculiarity of what has happened. In the United States, or indeed in the United Kingdom, political leadership is almost exclusively the province of those who have climbed the greasy pole of legislative service. You serve in the Senate or the House, or as a governor, you learn the dark arts of the committee room. Mark Carney bypassed this entirely. He walked off the street, or rather out of the boardroom, and into the Prime Minister's office. Political analysts are calling this historic and unprecedented, and for once those overused adjectives are understated. No one in Canadian history has moved from total political outsider to Prime Minister to election winner in the span of a single calendar year. What you're looking at is a fascinating assertion of the competence brand over the populist brand. At a moment when the democratic world is supposedly tired of experts, tired of elites, and tired of globalists, Canada did something counterintuitive. It hired the ultimate globalist expert. When the voters were staring down the barrel of economic uncertainty, tariffs, inflation, the volatility of the American administration next door, they did not choose the flamethrower. They chose the fire extinguisher. Carney's rise suggests that when the electorate feels genuine fear about their economic stability, the allure of the boring technocrat, the man who speaks the language of bond markets and G7 summits, becomes suddenly intensely magnetic. This matters to you because it reveals the hidden wiring of how power actually transitions in stable democracies when they are under stress. The Liberal Party realized that its current brand was toxic, so it severed the head and grafted on a new one that signaled something entirely different: seriousness. This was a ruthless, unsentimental, and highly effective operation. It reminds us that political parties are not just debating societies. They are organisms designed to survive. And in 2025, the organism survived by transforming itself into the image of Mark Carney. Let us be precise about what this designation actually signifies. When the Canadian press names a newsmaker of the year, it is not performing a function of celebrity journalism. It is aggregating the judgment of the country's editors and broadcasters regarding the single most consequential force in the public square. And in 2025, that force was not a movement or a protest or a natural disaster, but a man who executed a maneuver that political scientists will likely study for decades. The official record will show that in March of this year, Mark Carney did not merely win the Liberal leadership. He obliterated the competition. He secured more than 80% of the vote on the first ballot, a margin that usually exists only in dictatorships or perhaps in the dreams of insecure incumbents. This was not a contested convention. It was a desperate party handing over the keys to the only adult they could find who knew how to drive the car. He was sworn in as Prime Minister, replacing Justin Trudeau, whose 10 years in power had ended not with a bang, but with the whimpering sound of a caucus revolt and the resignation of a finance minister. And here is where the story diverges from the typical cautiousness of Canadian governance. A traditional caretaker prime minister would have sat in the office, rearranged the furniture, and waited for the clock to run out. Carney did the opposite. Within 2 weeks of taking the oath, he dissolved Parliament and took the country into a general election. Consider the audacity of that decision. He was a man who had never campaigned for a seat, asking a weary electorate to ratify his leadership before he had even unpacked his bags at 24 Sussex. And the electorate, defying the polls that had shown the Conservatives leading by historic margins, up to 26 points at one stage, gave him the mandate. To understand why you as a citizen should care about this sequence of events, you must look at the alternative reality that was staring Canada in the face. The country was drifting. The previous government was paralyzed by internal dissent and public fatigue. The opposition was preparing for a coronation of its own. The machinery of state was grinding against the friction of a government that had stayed too long at the fair. By injecting himself into the system, Carney did not just save a political party, he rebooted the operating system of the federal government. He replaced the melodrama of personality politics with the cold, hard calculus of economic necessity. This matters because your mortgage, your job security, and the price of the goods on your table are not determined by how well a politician performs in a viral video, but by how well the prime minister can navigate the treacherous currents of the global economy. The background to this moment is essential. We often forget how dire the situation was only a few months ago. The Liberal Party was facing an existential crisis, the kind that turned the progressive Conservatives into dust in 1993. The caucus was in open rebellion. The departure of key ministers signaled a sinking ship. The electorate had tuned out. Into this vacuum stepped a former central banker, a man whose previous public service involved setting interest rates and regulating financial systems, tasks that are vital but hardly the stuff of populist rallies. Yet it was precisely this lack of traditional political baggage that became his greatest asset. In a year defined by noise, his quiet, technocratic competence sounded like music to the ears of the voters. They were not looking for a friend. They were looking for a CE. And in Mark Carney, they found one who was willing to bet his entire reputation on the proposition that Canadians were ready to take their politics seriously again. Consider the mechanics of how this transformation actually occurred, because it reveals a great deal about the ruthlessness of Canadian political institutions when their survival is at stake. The Liberal Party of Canada is often sentimentalized by its supporters as a movement of high ideals, but in practice, it is the most unsentimental power broker in the Western world. When the party faces extinction, it does not cling to its past. It ruthlessly jettisons its leadership and imports a savior. We have seen this play before. In the late 1950s, when the Liberals were decimated by the prairie populist John Diefenbaker, they did not double down on the old guard. They went out and recruited Lester B. Pearson, a Nobel Peace Prize winner and diplomat who had barely spent a day in the partisan trenches. A decade later, facing a tired electorate, they plucked Pierre Trudeau from the academic and constitutional sphere, a man who treated Parliament with a certain intellectual detachment. Mark Carney is the latest iteration of this specific Liberal tradition, the importation of the great man from outside the system to rescue the system from itself. The mechanics of his ascent were brutal in their efficiency. You had a sitting Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who insisted he was staying, even as the floorboards of his caucus were rotting beneath him. The brewing revolt was not subtle. Ministers were resigning, backbenchers were muttering, and the polling numbers were catastrophic. The party did not hold a long, agonizing debate about its soul. It effectively decapitated its leadership and grafted Mark Carney onto the body of the party. It was a transaction. The party provided the infrastructure. Carney provided the credibility. And you have to Carney skipped the apprenticeship entirely. He bet on the fact that the Canadian electorate was so unnerved by the global instability, specifically the economic belligerence radiating from Donald Trump's Washington, that they would forgo the usual courtship ritual. He wagered that you, the voter, were not looking to fall in love. You were looking for insurance. This is why the conservative attack lines, which painted him as a button-down banker and an out-of-touch elite, failed to land with the expected force. In a normal year, being a central banker is a political liability. It suggests distance and coldness. But in 2025, with the Canadian economy threatened by U.S. tariffs and trade wars, central banker didn't read as elite, it read as qualified. The mechanism of his victory was not charisma, it was gravity.